afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome to the second last of the series of the seminars organised for the Masters in Youth Community and Social Regeneration in the Department of Sociology. I'm delighted, indeed, we're honoured today on the programme and in the department to receive Peter McVerry, a person that I've admired for a very long period of time in terms of his activism and his pronouncements on homelessness and the other issues around social injustice in Ireland. Many of you will be very familiar with Peter's work, his championing of the rights of the homeless, of youth homeless in particular. Many years ago I read an essay in a book of essays about class in Ireland, and Peter wrote about taking the Summerhill option, the option for the poor, and working and spending his life doing that. And he's very much lived that in practice. What I particularly admire about Peter McVerry is his fearlessness in criticising powerful interests in Irish society, the politically powerful, the economically powerful, and he has been consistent in his criticisms of how things have done, particularly around housing and homelessness, and that's something that we particularly admire in his work. He's here today to talk to the students on the programme and to the wider campus community about the issues around youth homelessness in Ireland. And after his talk, we'll have some time for some questions from Peter at the end. So thank you very much for attending this afternoon. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. As the parish priest would say, there's still some seats at the front. Anybody wants to take them. So what I want to do is just share with you my experience of working with homeless young people over almost 40 years now, how that has changed over the years, and to share some reflections on that. I began by, as Owen says, I went to Summerhill in the inner city in Dublin in 1974. And we weren't going there to work with homeless people, not at all. We went to the inner city because there was a problem with young people. Young people in that part of the inner city were leaving school at the very latest by the age of 12. They were hanging around the streets all day long. Most of their parents were unemployed, couldn't give them any money. So what were they doing? A little bit of robbing. And by the time they got to 16 and 17, they were doing an awful lot of robbing. And they were going to prison. And it was as predictable as day follows night. So we went in, and that was the problem we were trying to help. And we opened a youth club there for all the kids in the area. We had a great craft centre going where they could make various crafts, stools, leather belts, leather arm mat, and they were able to sell them, make a few bob. We had a few employment schemes going. And then I came across a kid sleeping on the streets, 9 years of age. So we said, well, we have a youth club, we have a craft centre, we have employment schemes, let's add a little hostel. So we opened a small little hostel for 6 boys, because it was all boys then, there were no girls on the streets back in the 1970s. We opened a small little hostel for 6 boys up to the age of 16. And I thought no more of it. I still wasn't going to spend my life working with homeless people. But I ran the hostel for a few years, and then they were leaving that at 16 and a half, and they were going back onto the streets. So we said, what's the point in having a hostel for young people up to the age of 16 if they're just going to go back onto the streets? So I was living in Ballymun then at that time, so I asked Dublin City Council for a flat to use as a hostel for the over 16s. And to my surprise, and to their regret ever since, they gave it to me. So we opened the hostel, then the numbers grew, we had to open another hostel, then the drug problem hit Dublin, we had to open a drug detox centre. Then the problem arose, where do young homeless people go when they come off drugs? Do they go back on the streets? Do they go back into hostels where drugs are in their face, in which case they've wasted their time? So we opened a drug-free aftercare house where they could live for 6 months. And the problem, where do they go after the 6 months? So we started getting a few apartments together so that they could go and live in one of the apartments for another 12 months after the 6 months. So that's how our trust developed. So from that 9-year-old kid, we now have 14 hostels. 4 of them are for young people under 18. We have about 130 apartments where we can give a homeless person a key key to the door and say this is for you for the rest of your life if you want it. We also use those apartments, and I'll come to this later. Young people leaving care, it's a very, very precarious situation. Aftercare services are pretty inadequate. So young people leaving our care services, we will automatically give them an apartment, and they can live there for a number of years with support from our staff, and don't have to face the awful situation of adult homelessness. So there's been 4 big changes in the issue of young people who are homeless over those 40 years. The first is obviously the numbers. When we started, there were very few young people on the streets. Very, very few. There should have been more. But young people didn't leave home. Even when the home was totally unsatisfactory, young people stayed at home and stuck it out. So there were actually very, very few homeless people, young people, coming looking for support or for accommodation. And today, of course, the numbers have gone up. I don't know what they are, probably around 800 young people today becoming homeless, looking for help every year, and in many cases getting good help. Second big change is the gender of homeless people. As I say, when we began, you wouldn't see a homeless girl on the street. There was one hostel in Dublin for homeless girls, and it was probably half empty. There were very few homeless girls on the streets, and now, of course, homelessness amongst girls is much, much greater. About a third of young homeless people now, I think, are girls. What's the reason for that? Well, we don't know, because nobody's done any research on it. There's an area there to be researched. But my theory would be that in those days, there were so few homeless people. Homelessness wasn't talked about. It wasn't in the media. It wasn't on television or the newspapers. And if a person was thinking of leaving home, it was a huge leap into the dark. They didn't know what awaited them out there on the streets. They didn't know what services were available. They didn't know where to go to get help. And so I think girls were much more reluctant to make that leap than boys were. And so they didn't become homeless. Today, homelessness, of course, is a much bigger problem. It's talked about, it's in the newspapers, it's on television, and probably a girl wants to leave home. She probably knows some other person has left home. And so it's not such a big leap into the dark, and so they're more inclined to do that. The third big change is the reasons why young people leave home, and I'll come to that in a moment. When we started, if a young person came to us to say they were leaving home, and you went down to their family, you knew within 15 seconds why the young person had left home. It was hopelessly dysfunctional at home. I'll give you some examples of that. But today you go down and sometimes you come away scratching your head, wondering, why did this young person leave home? You have a lovely home, parents are very caring. What has gone wrong? And of course the fourth big change is the political response. Back in those days, the authorities didn't want to know. They just were totally uninterested in homeless young people. They weren't interested in providing a service. Their attitude was that, yeah, these young people who are homeless, well, they're going to end up committing crime and they're going to end up getting locked up, and that'll be the solution. So there was no interest. I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. But today, of course, services for homeless young people are infinitely better. Not perfect, but infinitely better. Most homeless young people today get a good service. They will be, if they cannot be facilitated in going back home, they will be placed in a good foster home. If they can't be placed in a good foster home, they'll be placed in a good residential home, such as the 4 that we have. So most homeless young people do actually today get a good service. Some don't. Who doesn't get a good service? The more difficult kids. More difficult kids, and in my philosophy, the more difficult the child, the more damage the child has been by their experiences, and therefore the more help the child needs. But in fact, the more difficult you are, the less help you're going to get. You can be moved from foster home to foster home because foster homes can't cater for you, can't cope with you. Or if you have an addiction, of course. A lot of foster homes don't want a kid with an addiction because they may have their own children. So if you're difficult, you have an addiction, or if you're 17 years of age, you're not going to get a good service. The attitude is, well, they'll soon be 18, they're not our responsibility. If they go to the High Court, it'll take a year anyway for the High Court to hear the case, and I'm sure they'll be 18 by then. So I just dealt with a 17-year-old, he's going to be 18 in 2.5 months' time. Mother's an alcoholic, there's nothing in the house, there's no food, there's no heating, there's no lighting. The social worker said, well, they brought him, he doesn't come from Dublin, but he was sent into Dublin city centre for a hostel. He was scared stiff in the hostel all night long. He fled out of it in the morning, and the social worker's attitude is, well, if you want somewhere to stay, you're going to have to go back there tonight. So if you're almost 18, if you're over 17, you're very likely not to get a good service. Anyway, we began, as I say, in Summerhill. The first hostel we opened was in the inner city there. We opened it, as I say, because of this 9-year-old kid on the streets. So we made a proposal to the government to fund a small little hostel in the inner city for a few kids like this 9-year-old who were sleeping on the streets. Heard nothing more from them. But the inner city was beginning to explode. There was a lot of car stealing. I could look out my window from the inner city and you'd watch the kids in a stolen car passing a squad car, police car, and beeping the horn just to get a chase. It really was that bad. There were a lot of stolen cars, a lot of handbag snatching. And the junction of Summerhill and Gardiner Street in the inner city there was known as Handbag Junction. So the government response to this was to open Loughlin House up in County Cavan as a juvenile prison for 12 to 16-year-olds, staffed by prison officers with 2 weeks childcare training. Now we'd be horrified today at that, but that was their response. There was a lot of criticism from all the childcare agencies that if all you're going to do is to lock these kids up in 200 miles away from their home, what sort of response is that? And so the Minister for Health, who was Charlie Hoy at the time, had our proposal for a small little hostel in the inner city on his desk, and he jumped at it. Not because he saw the need, but because to divert the criticism of the opening of Loughlin House. So he told the health board, you get that going. And for the first and probably only time in my life, I had a good relationship with the health board. And they kept coming to me saying, when can you get this hostel open? But they were also telling me, we don't agree with this hostel. We don't see the point of this hostel. We don't want to fund this hostel, but we've been told by the minister to do it, so we're going to do it. So I said, yeah, we can open it now as we have a building. All we need is your signature to say you're going to fund it 100%. Oh, they said, oh. I said, unless you sign it, we're not opening it. So they signed it. Then I said, now here's another issue. We want a minibus. So they signed that as well. So we got what we wanted because there was political pressure to get this hostel open at that time. So the hostel opened. It was the first and only community-based hostel. As far as I know in Ireland, the theory was all the kids, it was in the inner city, all the kids were to come from the inner city, and all the staff were to come from the inner city. So it was a community-based hostel where everybody knew everybody else, and many of the parents would say, it was known as Peter's Place. Many of the parents would say, if my kid hadn't gone to Peter's Place, he would have been taken into care. Now he was actually taken into care coming down to us, but that was their perception. It wasn't being taken into care. It was going into what was a local community project. Now that couldn't continue. As the professionalisation of services increased, it became more and more impossible to get staff who were qualified from the inner city, and that part of it disappeared. But that was the theory. I'd love to see that continued. I'd love to see young people's hostels being community-based. I think they would have a far, far better success rate. At that time, of course, there was no minister, no junior minister for children. I think one of the first junior ministers for children was Frank Fahey. And Frank Fahey was given that responsibility, but because he was a junior minister, he didn't have a seat at the cabinet table. And after a year or two, Frank Fahey was promoted to the Department of Fisheries. And because he now had responsibility for our fish, he had a place at the cabinet table. And that said everything about the importance of children to the government establishment. As I say, when we began, if you went down to visit the families of young people who left home, you knew exactly why they had left home. Leaving home is almost always a breakdown in relationship with one or both parents. We had a young man, he grew up with his mother and his sister. Himself and his sister very close together. His mother was an alcoholic, she was also a mental health patient. And when he was 12 years of age, his mother stabbed his sister to death in front of him. Now he just left home, we don't know where he was for 5 years, sleeping on the street somewhere. Turned up at our door when he was 17, and he lived with us now for the rest of his life, because he now has serious mental health problems. Another young lad, 14 years of age, every time he went home, his mother slammed the door in his face, said, "Go away, you're not wanted here." How do you cope with that? You cope with that by taking drugs. Another young man, his mother was a drug user. Every morning, 12 years of age, before he went to school, he had to go into town, buy the heroin that his mother needed for the day, and he had to come back and help her to inject it, because she couldn't find a vein. When you're injecting for a long time, your veins shrivel up, it's hard to get the needle in. So not surprisingly, by 15, he was injecting heroin, and he was homeless. Another young lad knocked on my door late at night, 11 years of age, stoned, and said, "Can I stay?" I said, "No, you can't stay, you're only 11. And anyway, you have a home to go to." "Can't go home," he said. "Why can't you go home?" I asked him. "Just can't go home." Talked to him for a while, persuaded him to go home, put him into my car, drove him up to his house, said, "There you are, in you go." "Can't go in." "Why can't you go in?" I asked him. "Just can't go in." Talked to him for another little bit, discovered he was being sent out by his alcoholic parents every night into prostitution, had to come back with a certain amount of money, otherwise he'd get a hiding, and he had no money that night. So it's a breakdown in relationship which we tend to blame the parents for. I'll come back to that in a minute. I don't think we can blame the parents, but there's a tendency to blame the parents. That 9-year-old kid that I talked about, he was the result of us opening our hostel, very first hostel. Went up to visit his family. His parents were both alcoholics. They didn't pay the SB bill, so the flat was in darkness when the sun went down. His parents would be out in the pub every night. They'd come back about 1 o'clock in the morning, and about 3 nights a week they would have an almighty row. And they'd be fighting and shouting and screaming at one another and throwing things at one another. The cups would be flying across the room and smashing. And that might go on for 2 hours, till they fell asleep from drink and exhaustion. But the rest of the house was wide awake. So this young fella, 9 years of age, decided, right, once I'm out of here, once it gets dark, I'm out of here. And I'm not coming back till I know my parents are fast asleep in bed and all the fighting's over. But that meant staying out till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and as often as not staying out all night. And one of the places he slept, and one of the places that homeless people like to sleep if they can get it, is on the buses. There was a bus garage opposite his house, so he climbed over the wall into the bus, big long seat at the back of the bus. Said to one young homeless guy, he said, "Where did you sleep last night?" He said, "Sat in the buses." I knew him very well, so I could joke with him, and I said, "That must have been lovely, you must have had a great sleep there in the back seat." He said, woke up this morning, I was halfway to Galway." That's the risk you take. Anyway, this 9-year-old kid was trying to sleep on the buses. It was a freezing cold night, and he lit a little fire to keep himself warm inside the bus. And 3 buses went up in flames. So anyway, in those days, if a young person left home, there was a very, very good reason for leaving home. But it's always a breakdown in relationship. Another young mother brought her young fellow up to me, and she said, "Look, he can't live it up. Doesn't get on with the dad. And the two of them are always fighting and arguing. And if the young fella's sitting in the sitting room watching television, and the father walks in, the young fella gets up and walks out. And the tension in the house is terrible," she says. "One of them has to go." And so she said, "He can't stay at home." But she said, "I don't want him living with you, because you're running a hostel for homeless boys, and my boy isn't homeless." And what did she mean by that? She referred to the stigma that attaches to being parents of homeless children. They're seen as bad parents. So she would imagine if her son was known to be in a hostel for homeless boys, that every time she went to the shops, the neighbours would be looking out through the window and saying, "God, there's your one, what's going on in that house? They must be beating up the kid, or they're not feeding the kid there. They must be out drinking every night." That's the perception. But today, and increasingly, it's not the reality. Often, as I say, you go down to the parents and you come away scratching your head wondering, why did this kid leave home? Young fella came up to me and knocked on my door 2 o'clock in the morning, said, "Can I stay?" And I said, "What's the problem?" "My dad keeps hitting me," he says. So I said to myself, well, that's a good reason not to go home. I'm not going to send you home tonight. Go to bed there and we'll sort this out in the morning. So next morning, got him up and said, "No, I'm never going back home. My dad's always hitting me." So I said, "You stay here and I'll go down and talk to your parents." So down I went, and 2 nicer parents you couldn't meet. And they were worried sick about the young fella. And we had a great chat, and at the end of the chat I said to the father, "Do you ever hit him?" And the father said, "Well, when he's mitching from school, I give him a few clatters." And what was happening was he was coming up to doing his junior cert in a few months' time. And the parents were saying to him, "Look, we know you don't like school, but just stay in school and get your junior cert. You have to have a little bit of something to show for your education. So after you do your junior cert, you can do what you like. You can lie in bed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You can join the French Foreign Legion. You can do what you like. Just get your junior cert." And the young fellow was mitching from school 1-2 days a week. Parents got very frustrated, sat him down, tried to talk to him, made no difference. So this day he was mitching from school, he came back home, the father put him up against the wall, gave him a few clatters. And every day he was mitching from school now, he went home and he got a few clatters. So this particular day he was mitching from school, he didn't want to go home to get clattered. So he waited till 2 o'clock and knocked on my door. Now the next morning he had 2 reasons for not going home. He was afraid he was going to get clattered for being out all night as well. Anyway, to cut a long story short, their parents agreed we'd leave him in the hostel and see what happens. After a few weeks, he confided in me that he was being sexually abused by a youth leader who, in a club that he was going to, and the youth leader lived quite close to his parents' home, and he wasn't able to tell his parents. So his mitching from school was really a cry for help, but his parents couldn't pick up on it because they didn't know. And so what happened when his parents looked at him, all they saw was a little brat who didn't know what was good for him and who had to be made to go to school. And he looked at his parents. What did he see? Or what did he feel? He felt, here's parents who aren't interested in my problem. Of course, how could they be? They didn't know about it. All they want to do is get me to go to school, and that's not where I'm at. After a few weeks, he allowed me to tell his mother what had happened, then he allowed his mother to tell his father what had happened, and we were able to sit down and talk about it, and talking about it was the beginning of resolving the problem. And the young fellow went back home and stayed back at home. Don't know whether he ever did his junior cert or not, but it didn't matter anymore. Probably didn't. So there was a case where that young kid could easily have become homeless, gone onto the streets of Dublin, developed a drug problem, ended up in prison, and it wouldn't have been his parents' fault. His parents were good, caring parents. And I think that's increasingly what's happening today. So that when people blame the parents of homeless young people, I think it's very unfair. Even where the parents are inadequate, like parents who are alcoholics or parents who are drug users. I always say, well, maybe the parents grew up in a home where there was abuse or violence, and they never coped with that. Their only way of coping with that was maybe to drink or to use drugs. So if you want to blame the parents, then you have to go back maybe and blame the grandparents. Maybe they grew up in the same home. So blaming the parents is a total waste of time, and I think it's very unfair to many of the parents that we deal with. Why do young people take drugs? Some young people who come to us, not all by any means, but some take drugs. A lot of them take drugs for a very different reason to the reason why other young people might take drugs. Young people today would take drugs out of curiosity, see what they're like, take drugs out of peer pressure. These young people take drugs to forget their childhood memories and to suppress the feelings that are associated with those memories, and drugs work. Best thing ever. If you don't want to remember painful childhood memories, drugs work. One young girl said it very poetically, shortly before she died of a drug overdose. She said, "Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could run so fast that your memories couldn't catch up?" So they're using drugs to run away from their memories. So what happens when they come off drugs? When they come off drugs, all those memories and the feelings associated with them, they all come flooding back to the surface, and they come back with a vengeance. We had one young man, he was over 18, but had been with us since he was about 14. But he came down to our detox centre, came off drugs, came back to Dublin, was doing very well until his granny died. Went to the funeral of his granny. There in the front row of the mourners, he was sitting beside the uncle who had abused him as a child. All the memories, feelings came flooding back. And in the middle of that funeral service, I was saying the mass, so I was up here at the altar. I saw him get up out of the bench. He literally ran down the centre aisle of the church, out the front door, and the next day he killed himself. So for them, coming off drugs is hugely difficult and traumatic. And people look at drug users, homeless drug users, say, why don't they stop using drugs? It's often not as simple as that at all. They need all the counselling, the therapy, and the support that we can give them. And so for them, we can wrap services around them for 2 years. They can come to our detox centre, a 6-week detox. They can come off drugs. Then they go to a 6-month residential treatment centre where they get all the counselling that they need. Then they go to our drug-free aftercare house for 6 months and usually attend a day program. And then they can go into one of our apartments for at least 12 months with support from our staff on a visiting basis. So we can wrap services around somebody like that for about 2 years. And they really need that. If they're going to come off drugs and stay off drugs, they really need that. It's not just a question of doing a detox. And most of the young people we deal with come from poor families and poor neighbourhoods. I make a distinction between homeless and out of home. If young people leave home because of a breakdown in relationship with one or both parents, that can happen in any family. It can happen in any social group. It can happen in the smallest little village in Ireland. We had 3 brothers from a tiny little village in County Meath, one after the other, all leaving home. So breakdown of relationship can happen in any social group. But if you have money, if you're relatively well off, there are other options open to you. You can pay for counselling for the child. You can pay for family counselling. You can send the child to a boarding school, like my parents did for me. Or maybe you have a relative, an uncle or an aunt who can take the child in. They're wealthy enough, they have a spare room in their house, and they have the money, they can afford to look after the child. But it's poor kids for whom the only option is to become homeless, and they rely on what services the state can make available. Poor kids from poor neighbourhoods, because in those neighbourhoods, whatever social services may exist, They may be hopelessly inadequate, long waiting lists, and so what begins as a little problem between the young person and their parents doesn't get it dealt with at that stage, and the problem grows and grows and grows and grows until it becomes a crisis, and then it may be too late. Because homelessness isn't an event. Homelessness is a process. Homelessness isn't something that happens to a young person on the 11th of March 2015. Homelessness takes place over perhaps years. What begins as a problem, as a minor problem, can grow and grow and grow into a major problem. A young person might leave home, might walk out at 6 o'clock in the evening, by 11 o'clock in the evening they go back home. And then a month or two later, another crisis happens, they leave 6 o'clock in the evening, they might stay out now for three nights, staying with a friend. Then they go back home. Then a few months later, another crisis occurs, they might stay out for longer. So homelessness is a process that takes place over months or perhaps even years. And the earlier we can intervene in that process, the better chance we have of preventing people from actually becoming homeless. So if homelessness is about breakdown of relationship, then working with homeless people is about re-establishing relationships. It's about building relationships. When I read the reports, the HICWA reports of childcare centres, the only thing I'm really interested in is what they say about the relationship between the staff and the kids. And if that's positive, then I say the rest doesn't really matter. You know, we have become over-bureaucratized, but come to that in a minute. But really, it's all about the relationship. And if you have a good relationship between the staff and the kids, then that childcare home is doing a really good job. It's interesting that when young people leave us, and maybe they move on and come back a year or two later just to say hello, what's the first question they'll ask? First question they'll ask is so-and-so still working for you? And the person they're inquiring about was the person that they had a good relationship with, the person they felt cared about them, the person they felt important to. And what is it they thank us for? They'll say not so much thanks for helping me to get somewhere to live when I needed it, or thanks for helping me to get off drugs, but they'll say something like, thanks for being there for me when I needed you. What they remember and valued most was a relationship in which they felt cared for, in which they felt important, and in which they weren't being judged and condemned. Because the hardest part of being homeless is not sleeping on the streets. No, you get used to that. One young lad lived with us for a few years. When he was 18, he left us, went to live with his girlfriend. After about a year, they split up, and he went on to the streets because he had nowhere else to go. After a couple of months in the streets, he threw himself into the Liffey. To his dismay, he was rescued, and he was brought to hospital. And I went up to see him in hospital. He said, Peter, he said, I can't go on living like this. And I said to him, what do you mean? And he said, I can't go on living knowing that nobody cares. And that's the hardest part of being homeless, to know that if you disappeared off the streets of Dublin, nobody would even notice you were gone. Your life has no meaning, it has no value to anybody else. You have totally lost your dignity. So people say to me, what do we do with homeless people? I say, yeah, we can give some of them accommodation, we can give some of them drug treatment, we can give some of them counselling. But what we're really trying to do is to give them the message that they are just as important and just as valuable as anybody else. And if we're not giving them that message, we may as well pack up and go, because the rest isn't worth it. It's about giving people back a sense of their own dignity, because when you become homeless, your self-esteem hits rock bottom. You feel you're the dregs of society. You feel nobody cares about you, nobody wants you, and you hit self-esteem. Your self-esteem hits rock bottom. So in our work with homeless, I hate when our staff talk about clients. I hate the word client. I say, we're not working with clients. You know, we're working with homeless people, homeless young people. Client has all sorts of negative connotations for me. It implies a distance between you and the person you're working with. It implies a power relationship between you and the person. If you're counselling, then it's different. If you're counselling a client. But in this work with homeless people, building relationships, using the word client or having that concept that you're working with clients, I think is very counterproductive. And so today, with all the bureaucracy around homeless young people, the staff in our under-18s come to complain to me that they spend far more time filling out forms than they do working with people, young people. It's become a huge bureaucratic nightmare, really. Everything has to be recorded. And of course I can understand why, and maybe it's important that, but I think young people can sometimes get lost in the bureaucracy. So there's an emphasis on reports, an emphasis on efficiency, value for money, and in that whole process, if the young person gets lost, we're doing a bad job. We have to put the young person at the centre, and the reporting and all the bureaucracy has to take second place. And unfortunately, I think we've gone overboard, and we have put the bureaucracy into first place. As I say, at the beginning, when I started, there was very little interest in homeless people politically. What changed? What made the difference? It was the Child Care Act of 1991 made all the difference. Child Care Act had two sections. It was Section 3 and Section 5. We argued that Section 5 was unnecessary, but they still put it in. Section 3 meant that it was said that children who were not receiving adequate care at home, it was the responsibility of the state to provide them with care. Section 5 said that a homeless child, it was the responsibility of the state to provide a homeless child with accommodation. Now we felt if a child is homeless, that means they're not receiving adequate care and should be dealt with under Section 3, not under Section 5. But in fact they used Section 5 to focus exclusively on the homelessness part of their life, and the care often got lost. So once the Child Care Act was signed into law, any child who came to us under the age of 18, we would put them up for a few nights, but we get a solicitor's letter off the health board saying this child is under 18, your responsibility under the Child Care Act, what are you going to do about it? In fact, we employed a solicitor full time in order to write those letters. There were so many. And as I say, the response was to look after their homelessness. I remember we had one kid come up from the country, and we put him up and we got the letter off, so the health board came and they said, we're going to put him into a bed and breakfast. And they put him in a bed and breakfast, sharing a room with a Dublin kid who was using heroin. In the middle of the night, the Dublin kid climbed out the window, took this country kid with him. Bertie Ahern was Minister for Finance at the time. They robbed Bertie's ministerial car. They drove around all night, climbed back in the window in the early hours of the morning, and that's a crime that was never solved. So we went to the High Court, saying putting kids into bed and breakfast is not suitable accommodation under the Child Care Act, and the court agreed. So then they looked around for empty buildings that they had, and the next kids we had, they got an empty building, they painted up a couple of rooms, made one room into a bedroom, made another room into a sitting room, employed trainee psychiatric nurses to look after these kids. And they put them into the social worker who came and took the kids from us into this, and I just felt like, when I saw it, I just felt like turning around and bringing them back to you. It was again a disaster, hopeless, but they were trying to fulfill their responsibility under the Section 5 of the Child Care Act. And eventually, because it gave children a right to accommodation and care, if a child wasn't getting that right, they could go to the High Court. And about 100 kids went to the High Court over the next few years. And Judge Peter Kelly was dealing with these kids. And Judge Peter Kelly came to realise you can't deal with this on an individual basis. You have a child standing in front of you who's in need of accommodation, And the health board are saying we don't have any accommodation, but we will build accommodation. It's going to take us 2 years. What does Judge Peter Kelly do? Can't wave a magic wand and create accommodation. So Judge Peter Kelly then called in the minister, demanded that they outline his plans for providing accommodation for all these homeless young people. And the minister gave him the outline of the plans. A few months later, he called the minister back in and said, how's it going? And the minister said, oh, we've changed the plans. And Judge Peter Kelly threatened to jail 3 government ministers for failing to give these homeless children the right that they had under the Child Care Act. The government learnt their lesson. They never again gave anybody rights. Following that, there was a disability bill was introduced. And when the disability bill was introduced, all the agencies working with people with disabilities objected and said there's no mention of rights for people with disabilities in this bill. And so then the government fell and the bill fell with them. The new government brought in a new disability bill and they said we're going to give people with disabilities rights. And everybody was looking forward to this bill coming. And when the bill came out, what did they give them a right to? They gave them a right to an assessment, but no right to a service. And I think they learnt their mistake from the Child Care Act. 100 kids going to the High Court, huge media coverage. Some of these kids extraordinarily damaged by their childhood experiences, and they were actually living on the streets. Huge media coverage, judge threatening to jail government ministers, and so I think never again will they give them rights, give anybody rights. But in terms of adult homelessness, as you know, adult homelessness is going up and up and up. In Dublin there are 6 new people becoming homeless every day. Huge increase in the number of homeless, and I believe that we will never solve the problem of homelessness until we give homeless adults a right to accommodation. If we give them a right to accommodation, as we did for the children, then the government have to act and have to respond. Gone on too long. Let me just mention some of the problems that still exist. As I say, if you're over 17, you're not going to get much of a service, unfortunately, from the HSE. Big problem is aftercare. Children leaving care, some of them dread their 18th. Most children grow and look forward to their 18th birthday and to becoming finally and formally an adult. Many homeless young people dread their 18th birthday because they know that everything is going to change. Aftercare, particularly accommodation for children leaving care, is appalling. We had one kid came to us. He had been kicked out of the residential care home that he had been in. He had been put out on his 18th birthday, no accommodation arranged, no money in his pocket, and it was a Friday. He came to us. Luckily we were able to provide him with accommodation, but to do that to a young homeless, absolutely scandalous. Aftercare is hopelessly inadequate. In the Child Care Act of 1991 there is a section which says that the health board may provide aftercare. Now, we've argued that that should be changed to the health board must provide aftercare. But at the moment, if you're a nice homeless young person and you say please and you say thank you, yes, you'll get an aftercare service. But if you're anyway difficult at all, they'll drop you like a hot potato. Another problem is the out of hours. In Dublin we do have an out of hours service. 8 o'clock in the evening till 6 o'clock in the morning, there's a social worker on duty to deal with homeless young people. In the rest of the country there isn't, as far as I know, any out of hours service. That out of hours service was brought in by a particular minister with responsibility for young people, Chris Flood, terrific fellow, who insisted on this out of hours service being provided. The health board objected furiously at the time. Said we don't want to do this, we can't afford to do this, we don't see the need for this, and Chris Flood said you're doing it. And so they had to set up this out of hours service so that homeless young people Even if it's at night time, they have a service available. It's not a great service. They have to go to a Garda station to contact the social worker. That's for the protection of the social worker. It's not a great service, but at least it is available. The other problems, constant change of social workers for young people. They might deal with 3 social workers in 2 years. As social workers move on or retire or take maternity leave or whatever. And poor integration of services. Homeless people don't just have a homeless problem. They may also have an addiction problem. They may also need counselling. They may have a mental health problem. And getting services to integrate, to deal with the person rather than the specific issue is hugely problematic. So, sorry, I've gone on long enough. I'm going to cut it short there. And if anybody wants to ask me a question or make a comment or even to criticise me, if anybody wants to do that, please feel free.